The journey home took 3 days. Marcus drove slowly and Ember and Ash rode beside him in silence. They didn't play or explore like before. They simply sat close to each other and to him, processing a grief that was too large for their young minds to fully understand. At night, when Marcus set up camp, they would curl up against him and he would tell them stories, not stories from his life, but stories he had found in the ship's databanks. Tales of the Drakari homeworld, of great flyers who had soared through pink skies, of artists who had created beauty from metal and light, of explorers who had first looked up at the stars and dreamed of touching them. "Your people were remarkable," Marcus told them on the second night, as they huddled around a small fire. They built cities that floated in the clouds. They composed symphonies that lasted for days. They believed that every living thing had value and deserved respect. Ember rested her head on Marcus's shoulder, and Ash draped a wing over his arm. They listened to every word, their golden eyes reflecting the firelight. "You come from something beautiful," Marcus continued, "and that beauty doesn't die just because the people are gone. It lives in you. In your scales, in your wings, in your voices, and your hearts. You are the legacy of an entire civilization, and that is a precious thing to be." When they finally reached Marcus's home, the apiary hummed with welcoming sound. The bees had thrived in his absence, and his house stood just as he had left it. But everything felt different now. Marcus saw his home through new eyes, understanding what it represented. This was where 2 lost children had found sanctuary. This was where an impossible hope had been fulfilled. The first thing Marcus did was plant the bioluminescent flowers from the ship. He created a special garden for them, with conditions as close to the ship's garden as he could manage. The flowers took root and began to grow, their soft glow visible at night. Ember and Ash would sit with them for hours, and Marcus suspected the plants smelled like home to them, like something they remembered from before. Next, Marcus contacted the Interstellar Heritage Council. He sent them everything he had found, the ship's location, the log recordings, the cultural artifacts, the genetic data. He expected them to take over, to send teams of scientists and historians to study the site. Instead, they asked Marcus to be the primary steward of the discovery. "You found them," the council representative said over the video call. "You saved them. You understand what this means better than anyone. We'll provide resources and support, but this should be your project." Marcus looked at Ember and Ash, who were listening to the conversation with interest. They had grown so much in the months he had known them. They were nearly the size of adult humans now, with wings that could carry them for kilometers. They were smart and curious, learning new things every day. "Yes," Marcus said. "I'll do it." The work consumed the next years of Marcus's life, but it was good work, meaningful work. He documented everything about the Drakari culture that he could recover. He translated their literature, their scientific papers, their personal journals. He learned their songs and taught them to Ember and Ash, who sang them with voices that grew more beautiful as they matured. He refined the honey blend until it was perfect, and then he shared the formula with beekeepers across human space. Within a year, there were special Drakari memorial apiaries on 24 worlds, all producing the honey that had saved 2 lives. The honey became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the smallest and most unexpected places. Scientists from across the galaxy came to study Ember and Ash, but Marcus was fiercely protective. No tests that caused distress. No procedures that treated them like specimens rather than people. They were children, he told anyone who would listen. Orphans who had already lost everything. They deserved to be loved, not studied like lab experiments. Most scientists understood. Some didn't, and those people were politely told to leave Marcus's mountain and never return. As Ember and Ash grew into adults, they became magnificent. Ember's scales shone like living fire in the sunlight, reds and oranges and golds that seemed to shift and dance. Ash's scales held the colors of a storm, silvers and grays with hints of purple lightning. Their wings spanned 6 meters when fully extended, and they could fly higher and faster than any human aircraft on Cascadia 7. But they never left. People offered them everything: luxury homes on capital worlds, positions of honor, wealth beyond measure. Ember and Ash refused it all. They stayed with Marcus in his mountain home, tending the bees and the gardens, preserving the memory of their people. They learned to speak human languages, though their voices retained a musical quality that made every word sound like song. They learned to read and write in a dozen scripts. They studied everything they could about their own culture, and about the many cultures of the galaxy they now lived in. And they taught Marcus in return. They taught him their language, the true Drakari tongue that no other human had ever spoken. They taught him their songs and their stories. They taught him that grief and joy could exist in the same heart, that loss didn't mean the end of love. 5 years after finding the eternal flame, Marcus stood in his garden on a warm evening. He was 65 now, his hair completely white, his body slower than it used to be, but he felt more alive than he had in decades. Ember and Ash landed beside him, their arrival stirring the flowers and making the bees circle in confused patterns. They were adults now, fully grown and absolutely beautiful. The Heritage Council wants to build a memorial, Ember said. Her voice was like wind chimes in a breeze. At the crash site, they want to honor our people properly. What do you think? Marcus asked. Ash folded her wings carefully. We think it's good, but we want you to design it. No one else understands what it should say. Marcus considered this, a memorial to a lost people, created by a human who had never known them. It seemed impossible. But then again, everything about this situation was impossible. 2 extinct children finding a beekeeper in the mountains, honey saving a species, an old man becoming a father to aliens. I'll need your help, Marcus said. Always, Ember replied, nuzzling his shoulder with her scaled head. They worked on the memorial design for months. It would be built in the canyon, near but not on the crash site itself. The design incorporated elements from Drakari architecture, flowing lines and soaring spaces that seemed to defy gravity. In the center would be a garden with bioluminescent flowers and earth bees working among the blooms, a living symbol of how 2 species had come together to create hope. The walls would be inscribed with names, all 43 adults, all 10 hatchlings who had died. Every soul aboard the Eternal Flame would be remembered, and at the entrance, Marcus wrote a dedication that Ember and Ash approved with tears in their eyes. Here rest the last of the Drakari, starfarers and dreamers, artists and scientists, parents and children. They traveled 300 years to find a new home, and instead found an ending they did not deserve. But in their final days, they showed us the truth of civilization, that love is stronger than death, that hope can survive impossible odds, and that the greatest act of courage is to send your children forward with trust that someone will catch them. 2 children survived because their people believed in the kindness of strangers. Humanity proved that belief was not misplaced. Fly far, sailors of the Eternal Flame, you are not forgotten. On the day of the memorial's dedication, people came from across the galaxy. Humans, yes, but also representatives from dozens of other species. They came to honor the Drakari and to witness something rare. The last survivors of a lost people, alive and thriving against all odds. Ember and Ash sang the death songs, their voices echoing through the canyon in harmonies that made everyone present weep. Then they sang a new song, one they had composed themselves. It was a song of gratitude, of remembrance, of hope. A song that said, "We are still here, we remember, we will carry forward." Marcus stood beside them, an old human among the stars, and felt complete in a way he hadn't since losing his daughter. He had spent 15 years trying to forget how to love, how to care, how to hope, and then 2 impossible creatures had stumbled into his life and reminded him that love was worth the risk of loss, that caring was worth the pain of grief, that hope was worth believing in even when everything seemed dark. After the ceremony, as the crowds dispersed and the sun set over the canyon, Marcus sat with Ember and Ash at the memorial. The bioluminescent flowers began to glow in the twilight, and the bees returned to their hives for the night. "What happens now?" Ash asked quietly. Marcus smiled. "Now we go home. We tend the bees. We preserve your culture. We live." "For how long?" Ember asked. She knew humans didn't live as long as Drakari. Marcus was already old by human standards. "For as long as we can," Marcus replied. "And when I'm gone, you 2 will keep going. You'll teach others about your people. You'll make sure the Drakari are never truly extinct as long as you live. And maybe someday, if science advances enough, there might be more of you. Your genetic material is preserved. The possibility exists, but even if there are never more," Ash said, "and we were loved. Our people's last act was love, and your first act toward us was love. That matters. That matters more than anything," Marcus agreed. The holographic figure was a Drakari adult. her scales still showing traces of deep blue even in the recording. She looked tired, her wings drooping, her eyes dim. When she spoke, Marcus's translator picked up her words and rendered them in standard language. This is Chief Scientist Varen of the Generation ship Eternal Flame. Today is our 41st day on this world. I am the last adult still conscious. The others have already passed into the final sleep. I am recording this in hope that someone, someday, will find us and understand what happened. Marcus stood frozen, his hand gripping the edge of the console. Ember and Ash pressed against his legs, watching the hologram of their ancestor. Varen continued, her voice weak. We left our dying world 300 years ago by our reckoning. 212 souls aboard this ship, carrying everything we could save from our civilization. We knew the journey would be long. We knew some of us would die before we reached a new home. But we had hope. The hologram flickered, and Varen paused to take a labored breath. 6 months ago, we passed through a spatial anomaly near the Viridian Nebula. Our instruments failed. When they came back online, everything was wrong. The star charts didn't match. The date markers showed we had moved forward in time by 300 years. We had jumped from our era to this one in an instant. Marcus felt his chest tighten. A time anomaly. The Drakari hadn't been extinct at all. They had been thrown forward, arriving in a future where their entire species was already gone from the galaxy. We tried to contact other ships, other colonies, Varen said. But our communication systems were damaged in the anomaly. We detected this planet and decided to land for repairs. We thought we would be safe here. We were wrong. The hologram showed Varen touching her own scales, which were visibly duller than they had been at the start of the recording. The air here is breathable, but it contains trace elements that are toxic to our biology. We didn't know until it was too late. The adults began to sicken within days of landing. The crash had damaged our life support systems, and we couldn't filter the air properly. We tried everything to repair the ship to make it safe to call for help, but we were too weak and the damage was too extensive. Tears ran down Marcus's face as he watched. Varen coughed, and the sound was painful to hear. The children started dying first, she said, and her voice broke. The young ones couldn't tolerate the air at all. We lost 8 hatchlings in the first 2 weeks, 4 more in the following month. The parents who lost their children went into the final sleep quickly after. Grief is fatal to our kind when combined with physical weakness. Ember and Ash were making sounds of distress, pressing harder against Marcus. He wanted to turn off the recording to spare them this pain, but he couldn't. They needed to know. They deserved their history. Varen wiped her eyes with a clawed hand. We have 2 hatchlings left. Ember and Ash, the youngest of our children. They are small and weak, but they have survived when others didn't. The medical staff believe it's because they are still developing, still adaptable. Their bodies are fighting the poison better than the adults or the older hatchlings. Marcus gasped. She had named them. The scientist in this recording had given them their names. We know we are dying, Varen continued. All of us. The last few adults have perhaps a week left. We have made a decision. We cannot save ourselves, but we might save Ember and Ash. 3 days ago, we noticed earth bees near our crash site. They were drawn to our bioluminescent garden plants. One of our botanists realized that the nectar from those plants, when processed by the bees, might be close enough to our homeworld nectar to sustain the hatchlings. The hologram showed Varen standing, moving toward something off-screen. When she returned, she was holding 2 small bundles. Marcus recognized them instantly. Ember and Ash, so much smaller than they were now, sleeping in her arms. We have programmed their neural implants with one directive, Varen said, looking down at the sleeping hatchlings with infinite tenderness. Find the bees, find the sweetness, find hope. We are sending them out tomorrow with what little food we can spare. They are too young to understand fully, but their implants will guide them. They will know to seek out the bees, to seek out help. Varen's voice became thick with emotion. To whoever finds them, if anyone does, please know this. These are the last children of an entire civilization. We had art and music, science and philosophy. We had thousands of years of history and culture. All of that dies with us. But Ember and Ash can live. They can grow. They can remember. Please, if you have any mercy, any compassion, help them. Teach them about their people. Tell them they were loved beyond measure. The scientist set the hatchlings down gently and turned back to the camera. We are singing the death songs now, all of us who remain. We sing for our children, for our lost world, for everything we could not save. But we sing also with hope, because we are sending our youngest into the world with a chance. The universe took everything from us, but it cannot take our love for these two small lives. Varen raised her hand in what must have been a Drakari gesture of farewell. To Ember and Ash, if they ever see this, you are the legacy of the eternal flame. You carry within you the memory of a people who reached for the stars and refused to surrender to darkness. Live well. Fly far. Remember that you were wanted and cherished. Your parents' final act was to give you hope. The recording ended. The hologram disappeared, leaving Marcus standing in the dark ship with two grieving hatchlings pressed against him. Marcus slid down to sit on the floor, and Ember and Ash climbed into his lap. They were too big for this now, but they curled up as small as they could, trembling and making sounds that broke his heart. They were crying. These alien children were crying for parents they barely remembered, for a species that had died trying to save them. "I'm so sorry," Marcus whispered, wrapping his arms around them. "I'm so sorry you went through this." He sat there for a long time, holding them while they grieved. Around them the ship creaked and settled, a tomb for a civilization. Marcus thought about those final days. The adults knowing they were dying, spending their last strength to give two children a chance, programming their neural implants with just enough information to seek help, sending them out alone into an alien world, trusting that someone would show them kindness. And Ember and Ash had walked for days through the wilderness, two tiny creatures following an instinct they didn't understand, until they found his apiary. They had found the bees. They had found the sweetness. They had found a lonely old man who still remembered how to care. Marcus stood up carefully, still holding the hatchlings. He walked through the ship, his light revealing more bodies. 43 adults in total. 10 small hatchlings laid out in what must have been a memorial chamber, arranged carefully and surrounded by beautiful artifacts. The adults had honored their children before they themselves died. In the living quarters, Marcus found personal items, tablets with what looked like family photos, instruments for music that no one would ever play again, books written in a language that only two living beings could still read. He gathered what he could carry, placing items gently in his pack. These were treasures, pieces of history that needed to be preserved. Near the ship's exit, Marcus found one more thing. A garden room where bioluminescent plants still grew, powered by the ship's backup systems. They glowed softly in the darkness, purple and blue and green. Among them, he saw the flowers that must have produced the nectar that Drakari young needed. They were still alive, still blooming, waiting for children who would never come. Marcus carefully dug up several of the plants, wrapping their roots in damp cloth. He would take them home. He would keep them alive. As they left the ship, Ember and Ash looked back one final time. They spread their wings and made a sound, a long musical note that echoed through the canyon. It was a song, Marcus realized. A song of farewell, of remembrance, of grief. They were singing the death song for their people just as the adults had sung for them. Marcus stood with them in the fading light and added his own voice. He didn't know the words, didn't know the melody. But he hummed along, his human voice joining with their alien song in a shared expression of loss. When the song ended, Ember and Ash turned away from the ship and flew up toward the canyon rim. Marcus followed in his hauler, driving slowly up the path as the sun set behind them. The ship disappeared into shadow, and with it, the last physical connection to an entire civilization. But two of their children still lived, and Marcus would make sure they never forgot where they came from. Marcus barely slept that night. He sat at his desk, running every scan he could on the metal fragment. His equipment was old, meant for analyzing biological samples rather than spacecraft debris, but it could still tell him things. The metal was an alloy used in long-range vessels, designed to last for centuries in deep space. The fragment showed signs of extreme heat on one side and impact damage on the other. A crash. The ship had crashed. By morning, Marcus had sent the fragment's signature to his computer and started running search patterns across Cascadia 7's surface. The planet was mostly mapped, but there were remote areas that few people visited. Deep canyons, dense forests, mountain ranges that were too dangerous or too empty to interest colonists. Ember and Ash woke up and found Marcus still at his desk. They brought him food, a behavior they had learned by watching him care for them. Ash dropped a nutrition bar in his lap, while Ember pushed a cup of water toward his hand with her nose. Marcus smiled despite his exhaustion. "Thank you," he said, patting their heads. "You two are getting good at taking care of me." He ate while watching his screen. The search was slow, looking for metal signatures that matched the fragment. Most hits were false positives, old mining equipment or crashed satellites. But then, 3 hours into the search, he got something different. A canyon 300 kilometers to the east showed a massive metal signature buried in its floor. The size was wrong for mining equipment. It was too big, too concentrated. Marcus pulled up satellite images of the area, but the canyon was deep and narrow, its floor hidden in shadow most of the day. The images showed nothing useful, but the metal signature was there. Something large had crashed in that canyon, and the composition matched the fragment Ember and Ash had brought him. Marcus looked at the hatchlings. They were playing with one of his old scarves, tugging it back and forth between them. They looked happy and healthy now, their scales bright and their wings strong. In the past weeks, they had grown so much. They could fly short distances. They understood dozens of his words, and they had started making sounds that almost seemed like attempts at human speech. They trusted him completely. They loved him, and he loved them. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said to them. They stopped playing and looked at him with those golden eyes. "I found something. I think I found where you came from." Ember tilted her head, a gesture that meant she was listening carefully. Ash moved closer, pressing against Marcus's leg. Marcus picked up his tablet and showed them the location marker on the map. "There's a ship. Your ship, I think. 300 kilometers from here." He didn't know if they understood maps, but both hatchlings stared at the screen. Ember made a sound, low and almost mournful. Ash began to tremble. They knew. Somehow they knew. "We can go there," Marcus said softly. "We can find out what happened. You deserve to know where you came from." It took him 2 days to prepare. He loaded his old cargo hauler with supplies, food, water, camping equipment, medical gear, and jars of the special honey blend for Ember and Ash. The hauler was designed for rough terrain, but the journey would still be difficult. The canyon was in an area with no roads and barely any trails. On the morning they left, Marcus took one last look at his apiary. His bees hummed peacefully in their hives, unaware that their keeper was about to uncover something that would change everything. He had set up automatic feeders to keep them cared for while he was gone. Ember and Ash rode in the hauler with him, pressed against his sides. They were quiet during the journey, none of their usual playful energy. They stared out the window at the passing landscape, occasionally making soft sounds to each other that Marcus couldn't interpret. The terrain grew rougher as they traveled east. Forest gave way to rocky hills, then to badlands scarred by ancient volcanic activity. Marcus had to slow down many times to navigate around boulders and dried creek beds. The hauler's suspension groaned with the effort. On the second day, they reached the edge of the canyon. Marcus stopped the hauler and got out, walking to the rim. The canyon was even more impressive in person than on the satellite images. It was at least a kilometer wide and so deep that the bottom was lost in shadow. The walls were steep, made of dark red rock that reminded Marcus of rust. Ember and Ash joined him at the edge. Both hatchlings stood completely still, staring down into the darkness. Then Ember spread her wings and jumped. "No," Marcus shouted, reaching for her, but she was already falling. Except she wasn't falling. She was flying. Her wings caught the air and she glided down into the canyon in smooth, controlled spirals. Ash looked at Marcus once, her golden eyes somehow sad, and then she jumped too. Marcus stood at the edge, heart pounding, watching the two hatchlings disappear into the shadows below. "Come back," he whispered. "Please come back." He waited for 10 minutes that felt like hours, Then he saw them returning, flying up from the depths. They landed beside him, and Marcus nearly collapsed with relief. "Don't do that again," he said, hugging them both. "You scared me." But Ember and Ash were making urgent sounds, tugging at his clothes with their small claws. They wanted him to follow. They wanted him to see. Marcus spent the next 2 hours finding a path down. The canyon walls had natural ledges and slopes in some places, and he carefully drove the hauler along these, reversing and trying new routes when paths became too narrow or too steep. Ember and Ash flew alongside him, sometimes landing on the hauler's roof to rest, sometimes disappearing ahead to scout the way. Gully, as the sun reached its highest point and light penetrated the canyon floor, Marcus saw it. The eternal flame lay broken across the rocky ground. It was huge, easily 5 times the size of Marcus's house. The ship's hull was cracked open in places, exposing dark interior corridors. One of the main engines had torn free and lay 50 meters from the rest of the ship. Debris was scattered everywhere. Marcus stopped the hauler and sat in silence, staring at the wreckage. This was a generation ship, designed to carry a population across the galaxy for hundreds of years. It should have been in deep space, maintaining a fragile civilization in the void between stars. Instead, it was here, destroyed on a planet it should never have reached. Ember and Ash flew to the ship's entrance, a gaping hole where a door had once been. They landed and looked back at Marcus, waiting. He grabbed his scanner and a portable light, then walked toward them. His hands were shaking. Part of him didn't want to go inside. Part of him knew that whatever he found in there would change everything, but Ember and Ash needed to know. They deserved the truth, no matter how painful. "Okay," Marcus said, joining them at the entrance. "Let's find out what happened to your people." The ship's interior was dark and cold. Marcus's light cut through the blackness, revealing corridors with strange architecture. Everything was built for beings larger than humans but smaller than the massive Drakari of legend. The walls were decorated with beautiful patterns, etched metal that caught his light and threw back glimmers of color. Ember and Ash moved through the ship like they knew it. They led Marcus deeper inside, past what looked like living quarters and communal spaces. The ship was silent except for the sound of their footsteps and the occasional groan of settling metal. Then Marcus saw the first body. It was an adult Drakari, easily twice the size of a human, lying in what must have been a medical bay. Its scales were dull gray, all color long faded. The body had been dead for months, maybe longer. Ember and Ash made sounds of grief, high-pitched keening that echoed through the ship. They didn't approach the body. They just stood there, crying for someone they might have known. Marcus counted as they went deeper. 3 bodies in the medical bay, 5 more in the corridors. Adults, all of them, their bodies positioned as if they had simply laid down and never gotten up again. In what looked like a central command room, Marcus found a console that still had power. The ship must have had backup systems, something running on emergency reserves. He activated the console and a holographic display flickered to life. It was a log entry. The last log entry, and as Marcus watched it, his heart broke into pieces. Marcus named them Ember and Ash, the larger one, with scales that showed hints of red and orange when the light hit them right, became Ember. The smaller one, whose scales held more silver and gray, became Ash. The names felt right, and the creatures seemed to respond to them after just a few days. The first week was the hardest. Marcus learned quickly that while honey kept them alive, his regular honey wasn't quite right. Ember and Ash would eat it, and they would feel better for a few hours, but then they would grow weak again. Something was missing from what their bodies needed. Marcus turned his entire house into a research station. He pulled out his old university textbooks, files he had saved on his tablet, and every scrap of information about the Drakari he could find. Most of it was historical data, stories about their culture and their wars. But buried in academic papers and old expedition reports, he found what he was looking for. Drakari young needed a specific compound to grow properly. On their homeworld, which had been destroyed centuries ago, they got it from flowers that grew in vast fields. The flowers produced nectar with a unique structure, a complex sugar that helped young Drakari develop into adults. Without it, their metamorphosis would fail. They would stay trapped in their juvenile forms until their bodies gave out. Marcus read the chemical breakdown of that alien nectar and compared it to Earth honey. They were similar but not the same. Close enough that honey kept Ember and Ash alive, but not close enough to let them truly thrive. He sat at his kitchen table, looking at the chemical formulas on his screen, while Ember and Ash slept in a nest they had made from his blankets. "I can fix this," he told them quietly. "I just need to figure out how." The answer came from an unexpected place. Cascadia 7 had been terraformed with earth plants, but it also had its own native flowers. Some of them had evolved in strange ways, developing compounds that didn't exist on Earth. Marcus had always kept his bees away from certain native flowers because they produced honey with unusual properties. What if that was exactly what he needed? Marcus began experimenting. He set up small test hives and let his bees gather nectar from different combinations of earth and native flowers. He tested each batch of honey, comparing its chemical structure to what the Drakari young needed. Most attempts were failures. Some honey was too bitter. Some made the hatchlings sick. But Marcus kept trying. Ember and Ash watched his work with curious eyes. They followed him everywhere, even out to the apiary where the bees buzzed around their hives. The creatures seemed fascinated by the bees. They would sit for hours watching the insects fly back and forth, their golden eyes tracking each movement. One afternoon, Marcus was working at one of his experimental hives when Ember chirped urgently. The hatchling was staring at a cluster of purple flowers growing wild near the hive. Marcus had always thought they were weeds and had planned to remove them. "What is it, girl?" Marcus asked. He had started to tell them apart not just by size but by personality. Ember was bold and curious. Ash was quieter, more cautious. Ember walked to the flowers and gently touched one with her nose. She made a sound, something between a chirp and a hum, and looked back at Marcus. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "You're trying to tell me something." He took a sample of the purple flowers and tested them. The results made him catch his breath. The flowers produced a compound remarkably similar to what the Drakari nectar had contained. Not exact, but closer than anything he had found. That night, Marcus set up a special hive near the purple flowers. He watched as his bees discovered them and began bringing the nectar back. Within days, he had a small batch of honey with a different color and scent than his usual product. It was darker, almost amber, with a smell that reminded him of cinnamon and something else he couldn't identify. He gave a small amount to Ember and Ash. They ate it slowly, and Marcus watched them carefully for any bad reactions. But instead of getting sick, the hatchlings began to glow. Their scales brightened with colors that had been hidden before. Ember's reds and oranges became vibrant like fire. Ash's silvers turned luminescent like moonlight. They chirped happily and looked at Marcus with joy in their eyes. Then they did something that made his throat tighten. They both pressed their heads against his chest, one on each side, making a rumbling sound that he realized was their version of a purr. "You're welcome," Marcus whispered, wrapping his arms around them. Over the following weeks, Marcus refined his honey blend. He planted more of the purple flowers, along with other native plants that his research suggested might help. His bees adapted quickly, and soon he had hives producing exactly what Ember and Ash needed. The change in the hatchlings was dramatic. They grew bigger and stronger. Their wings, which had been torn and weak, healed and grew. They started trying to fly, making short hops around Marcus's house that often ended in crashes and tumbles, but they never got discouraged. They would just pick themselves up and try again. Marcus found himself laughing for the first time in years. Watching Ash crash into a curtain or Ember get her wing stuck in a bookshelf was somehow the funniest thing he had ever seen. The hatchlings would look at him with such indignant expressions, as if asking why he was laughing at their struggles. But they were learning. He was teaching them, and they were teaching him. Marcus began to understand their chirps and body language. A certain sound meant they were hungry. Another meant they wanted to play. A low rumble meant they were content. A sharp chirp meant danger or fear, and they were learning from him too. They watched how he cared for the bees, how he was gentle and patient. They saw how he talked to the insects even though the bees couldn't understand. They learned that living things deserved kindness. One evening, Marcus was sitting on his porch with Ember and Ash beside him. They were bigger now, almost the size of large dogs. Their wings had grown strong enough for actual flight, though they still preferred to stay close to him. Ash, the quieter one, suddenly got up and walked into the house. Marcus heard rummaging sounds, and then Ash returned, carrying something in her mouth. She dropped it at Marcus's feet. It was a small piece of metal no bigger than Marcus's palm. It was dirty and bent, but Marcus could see markings on its surface. Symbols he didn't recognize. "Where did you get this?" Marcus asked. Ember got up and brought him another object. A shiny pebble, but not a natural one. It was too perfectly shaped, too smooth. Marcus looked at both objects and then at the hatchlings. "You've been bringing me gifts." They chirped and pressed against him. Over the past weeks, they had brought him many things. Pretty stones, interesting leaves, bits of metal they found around the property. Marcus had thought they were just playing. But now, looking at the piece of metal with its strange markings, he realized something. These objects meant something. They were clues. Marcus took the metal piece inside and cleaned it carefully. Under the dirt, he could see the markings more clearly. They were not random scratches. They were writing in a language that his translator couldn't identify immediately. But his old research programs had access to databases of dead languages. It took 3 hours, but finally his computer found a match. The symbols were Drukhari script, and the metal was from a ship. Marcus stared at the screen as the translation appeared. The words were simple, just a ship designation and a name, but those words changed everything. Eternal Flame, Marcus read aloud. Generation ship Eternal Flame. He looked at Ember and Ash, who were watching him with their intelligent golden eyes. They had brought him a piece of their past, a piece of their home, which meant somewhere on this planet there was a Drukhari ship, and if there was a ship, there might be answers. The morning mist clung to the mountain slopes like a blanket. Marcus Chen stood on his porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee and watching the sun try to break through the gray clouds. He was 60 years old, with silver hair and weathered hands that had once held scientific instruments but now mostly handled beehives. This quiet life suited him. No noise, no crowds, just him and his bees on this remote corner of Cascadia 7. He took a sip of coffee and listened to the familiar hum from his apiary. The earth bees he kept here were special. They had adapted well to this terraformed world, producing honey that people across 3 star systems would pay good money for. But Marcus didn't do it for the money. He did it because the bees needed him and he needed them. They gave him something to care about. 15 years ago, Marcus had been a different man. He had worked as a xenobiologist on the capital world, studying alien life forms and traveling between planets. He had a daughter named Sarah, who loved to hear his stories about strange creatures from distant worlds. Then one day a shuttle malfunction took her away. After that, Marcus couldn't look at the stars the same way. He retired, moved to this mountain, and tried to forget. But this morning, something was different. As Marcus walked toward his beehives, he noticed the bees were acting strange. They circled in agitated patterns, and their usual calm hum had turned into something more urgent. He frowned and walked faster. That's when he saw them. 2 small creatures huddled near the entrance of his largest hive. They were about the size of house cats, covered in scales that shimmered with colors Marcus had never seen before. Even dirty and dull, the scales caught the weak sunlight and threw back hints of purple, blue, and gold. The creatures had small wings folded against their bodies, torn and damaged. They made soft, chirping sounds like birds in distress. Marcus stopped walking. His scientific training kicked in immediately, overriding his surprise. These were not native to Cascadia 7. These were not any species he had seen in his 40 years of studying alien life. But something about their body structure, the way their wings attached to their shoulders, the shape of their elongated heads triggered a memory. Drukhari, he whispered, but that was impossible. The Drukhari had been extinct for 300 years. Every xenobiologist learned about them in school as a cautionary tale about a civilization lost to war and disaster. One of the creatures lifted its head and looked directly at Marcus. Its eyes were large and golden, filled with something that made Marcus's chest tighten. Intelligence. Fear. Hope. The creature made a sound, not quite a chirp, not quite a cry, and took a trembling step toward him. Marcus should have been cautious. These were unknown creatures, possibly dangerous, but all he saw were 2 small, scared beings who were clearly in trouble. He knelt slowly, setting his coffee cup on the ground. "Hey there," he said softly. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The second creature, smaller than the first, tried to stand but collapsed. Marcus saw its sides heaving with effort. They were dying. He could see it in the way their scales lacked luster, the way they moved with painful slowness. Marcus moved carefully toward them, hands open and visible. The first creature watched him with those golden eyes but didn't back away. When Marcus was close enough, he could see they were young, probably children of their species. Their wings were small and underdeveloped, their scales soft in places where adult scales should have been hard. "Where did you come from?" Marcus asked, even though he knew they couldn't answer. "Where are your parents?" The smaller one made a weak sound and closed its eyes. Marcus made a decision. He gently picked up the collapsed creature, surprised by how light it was. Its scales were warm to the touch, warmer than they should be. Fever, maybe, or their species' normal temperature. The creature didn't struggle. It simply lay in his arms, breathing shallowly. The larger one chirped urgently and grabbed Marcus's pant leg with tiny clawed hands, looking up at him with pleading eyes. "Come on, then," Marcus said. "Both of you." He carried the smaller creature into his house, with the larger one following at his heels. Inside, Marcus laid the sick one on his couch and quickly grabbed his old field scanner from a storage box. He hadn't used it in years, but it still worked. He ran it over both creatures, and the readings made his blood run cold. Their body temperature was dropping. Their metabolic rate was crashing. They were starving, not just for food but for something specific their bodies needed. Without it, they would die within days, maybe hours. Marcus ran to his kitchen and started pulling out everything he had. Dried meat, fruits, vegetables, nutrient paste. He offered each one to the creatures, but they turned their heads away weakly. They looked at the food with confusion, as if they had never seen such things before. The larger one, still slightly stronger, wandered around Marcus's living room, sniffing at things. It knocked over a shelf and a glass jar rolled across the floor. The jar cracked and thick golden honey spilled out onto the wooden boards. Both creatures' heads snapped toward the smell. The larger one rushed to the honey and began lapping it up frantically. The smaller one, still lying on the couch, made urgent sounds and tried to lift its head. Marcus stared for a moment, then understanding hit him. He grabbed the jar and brought it to the smaller creature, letting honey drip onto its mouth. The creature's tongue, surprisingly long and delicate, caught the drops. It swallowed, and Marcus saw color begin to return to its scales. "Honey," Marcus said in wonder. "You need honey." He spent the next hour feeding both creatures small amounts of honey, careful not to give them too much too fast. As they ate, they grew stronger. Their scales began to shine. Their eyes became brighter and more alert. They made happy, chirping sounds and looked at Marcus like he had just saved their lives, because he had. As the sun set that evening, Marcus sat on his floor with both creatures curled up against him. They had eaten 3 jars of his honey and now slept peacefully, their small bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. One of them had its tiny clawed hand wrapped around Marcus's finger. He looked at them and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Purpose. Someone needed him. These 2 impossible creatures, survivors of an extinct species, had somehow found their way to his door. They had come to a beekeeper of all people because they needed what his bees made. Marcus gently stroked the scales on the nearest one's head. "I don't know where you came from," he whispered, "but I'm going to figure it out, and I'm going to keep you alive. I promise." Outside, his bees hummed their evening song, and 2 lost children from an impossible past slept in the arms of a lonely old man who had just found a reason to live again.